Penguin Random House Audio presents A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a master class on writing, reading, and life, by George Saunders. Read by the author with Phylicia Rashad, Nick Offerman, Glenn Close, Keith David, Rainn Wilson, B.D. Wong, and Renée Elise Goldsberry. Note to listeners: this program includes a downloadable PDF that contains the tables, outlines, figures, and appendices from the book. Also, tune in after the credits for an uninterrupted reading of In the Cart.
To my students at Syracuse, past, present, and future, and in grateful memory of Susan Campbell. Ivan Ivanitch came out of the cabin, plunged into the water with a splash, and swam in the rain, thrusting his arms out wide. He raised waves on which white lilies swayed. He swam out to the middle of the river and dived, and a minute later came up in another spot and swam on and kept diving, trying to touch bottom. "By God," he kept repeating delightedly, "by God." He swam to the mill, spoke to the peasants there, and turned back, and in the middle of the river lay floating, exposing his face to the rain. Borkin and Alyohin were already dressed and ready to leave, but he kept on swimming and diving. "By God," he kept exclaiming, "Lord have mercy on me." "You've had enough," Borkin shouted to him. Anton Chekhov, Gooseberries. We begin. For the last 20 years at Syracuse University, I've been teaching a class in the 19th century Russian short story and translation. My students are some of the best young writers in America. We pick 6 new students a year from an applicant pool of between 600 and 700. They arrive already wonderful. What we try to do over the next 3 years is help them achieve what I call their iconic space, the place from which they will write the stories only they could write, using what makes them uniquely themselves, their strengths, weaknesses, obsessions, peculiarities, the whole deal. At this level, good writing is assumed. The goal is to help them acquire the technical means to become defiantly and joyfully themselves. In the Russian class, hoping to understand the physics of the form, how does this thing work anyway, we turn to a handful of the great Russian writers to see how they did it. I sometimes joke, and yet not, that we're reading to see what we can steal. A few years back, after class, chalk dust hovering in the autumnal air, old-fashioned radiator clinking in the corner, marching band practicing somewhere in the distance, let's say, I had the realization that some of the best moments of my life, the moments during which I've really felt myself offering something of value to the world, have been spent teaching that Russian class. The stories I teach in it are constantly with me as I work, the high bar against which I measure my own. I want my stories to move and change someone as much as these Russian stories have moved and changed me. After all these years, the texts feel like old friends I get to introduce to a new group of brilliant young writers every time I teach the class. So I decided to write this book, to put some of what my students and I have discovered together over the years down on paper, and in that way offer a modest version of that class to you. Over an actual semester, we might read 30 stories, 2 or 3 per class, but for the purposes of this book, we'll limit ourselves to 7. The stories I've chosen aren't meant to represent a diverse cast of Russian writers, just Chekhov, Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Gogol, or even necessarily the best stories by these writers. They're just 7 stories I love and have found eminently teachable over the years. If my goal was to get a non-reader to fall in love with a short story, these are among the stories I'd offer her. They're great stories, in my opinion, written during a high-water period for the form. But they're not all equally great. Some are great in spite of certain flaws. Some are great because of their flaws. Some of them may require me to do a little convincing, which I'm happy to attempt. What I really want to talk about is the short story form itself, and these are good stories for that purpose. Simple, clear, elemental. For a young writer, reading the Russian stories of this period is akin to a young composer studying Bach. All of the bedrock principles of the former are on display. The stories are simple but moving. We care about what happens in them. They were written to challenge and antagonize and outrage, and, in a complicated way, to console. Once we begin reading the stories, which are, for the most part, quiet, domestic, and apolitical, this idea may strike you as strange. But this is a resistance literature, written by progressive reformers in a repressive culture, under constant threat of censorship, in a time when a writer's politics could lead to exile, imprisonment, and execution. The resistance in the stories is quiet, at a slant, and comes from perhaps the most radical idea of all, that every human being is worthy of attention, and that the origins of every good and evil capability of the universe may be found by observing a single, even very humble, person and the turnings of his or her mind. I was an engineering student in college at the Colorado School of Mines, and came to fiction late with a particular understanding of fiction's purpose. I'd had a powerful experience one summer, reading The Grapes of Wrath at night in an old RV in my parents' driveway in Amarillo, after long days working in the oil fields as what was called a jug hustler. My fellow workers included a Vietnam vet who, there in the middle of the prairie, periodically burst into the voice of an amped-up radio host. "This is WVOR, Amarillo," and an ex-con, just out of jail, who every morning, in the van on the way to the ranch where we were working, would update me on the new and perverse things he and his lady had tried sexually the night before, images that have stayed with me ever since, sadly. As I read Steinbeck after such a day, the novel came alive. I was working in a continuation of the fictive world I saw. It was the same America, decades later. I was tired, Tom Joad was tired. I felt misused by some large and wealthy force, and so did Reverend Casey. The capitalist behemoth was crushing me and my new pals beneath it, just as it had crushed the Okies who'd driven through this same panhandle in the 1930s on their way to California. We too were the malformed detritus of capitalism, the necessary cost of doing business. In short, Steinbeck was writing about life as I was finding it. He had arrived at the same questions I was arriving at, and he felt they were urgent, as they were coming to feel urgent to me. The Russians, when I found them a few years later, worked on me in the same way. They seemed to regard fiction not as something decorative, but as a vital moral ethical tool. They changed you when you read them, made the world seem to be telling a different, more interesting story, a story in which you might play a meaningful part, and in which you had responsibilities. We live, as you may have noticed, in a degraded era, bombarded by facile, shallow, agenda-laced, too rapidly disseminated information bursts. We're about to spend some time in a realm where it is assumed that, as the great 20th century Russian short story master Isaac Babel put it, no iron spike can pierce a human heart as icily as a period in the right place. We're going to enter 7 fastidiously constructed scale models of the world, made for a specific purpose that our time maybe doesn't fully endorse, but that these writers accepted implicitly as the aim of art. Namely, to ask the big questions. How are we supposed to be living down here? What were we put here to accomplish? What should we value? What is truth anyway, and how might we recognize it? How can we feel any peace when some people have everything and others have nothing? How are we supposed to live with joy in a world that seems to want us to love other people, but then roughly separates us from them in the end, no matter what? You know, those cheerful Russian kinds of big questions. For a story to ask these sorts of questions, we first have to finish it. It has to draw us in, compel us to keep going. So the aim of this book is mainly diagnostic. If a story drew us in, kept us reading, made us feel respected, how did it do that? I'm not a critic or a literary historian or an expert on Russian literature or any of that. The focus of my artistic life has been trying to learn to write emotionally moving stories that a reader feels compelled to finish. I consider myself more vaudevillian than scholar. My approach to teaching is less academic. Resurrection in this context is a metaphor for political revolution, an ongoing concern in the Russian zeitgeist, and more strategic.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?